Welcome to the war narrative where wars become stories. It is September 1683, and the city of Vienna is shaking with fear. From the high walls, defenders look out across the flat land by the Danube River, where a sea of autumn tents stretches endlessly to the horizon. The thunder of drums and the loud sound of horns carry across the autumn air, a constant reminder that an empire has come to settle old arguments. At their head stands Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man whose ambition burns as brightly as the thousands of campfires that flicker at night. He intends to succeed where even Suleiman the Magnificent had failed more than a century before. Vienna, jewel of the Habsburg crown, was not simply another city. To the Ottomans, it represented unfinished business. Back in 1529, Suleiman's mighty army had marched on these same walls, only to be turned back by heavy rains, muddy roads, and the sheer stubbornness of the defenders. The memory of that failed siege lingered in Ottoman memory like a wound left unhealed. To conquer Vienna was to erase humiliation and to declare the Ottoman Empire's destiny as the true heir of Rome. Kara Mustafa knew that if he brought Vienna to its knees, his name would be spoken in the same breath as Suleiman's, if not above it. But Vienna was more than just a military target. It was the beating heart of Central Europe, a crossroads of trade, faith, and politics. To hold Vienna meant commanding the gateway into the German states, and beyond them, Western Europe. To lose it would be catastrophic for the Habsburg dynasty, whose empire already staggered under the weight of previous wars. Emperor Leopold I himself, sensing the danger, had abandoned the capital and fled westward, leaving the city to stand alone. Inside Vienna's walls, Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg prepared to fight not only for stone and mortar, but for the survival of his people. For Kara Mustafa, the moment felt preordained. He had spent months preparing roads, bridges, and supply lines, correcting the very mistakes that had doomed the Ottoman attempt of 1529. His army, nearly 150,000 strong, was more than double the size of Vienna's garrison. He carried with him the prestige of a rising Ottoman state that stretched from the Balkans to the gates of Persia. And yet, beneath the grandeur of his encampment, there lingered something more dangerous, a sense of destiny that left little room for caution. On the morning of September 11th, Vienna's defenders could hear the distant rumble of sappers digging under their walls, the crack of axes tearing down buildings outside the gates, the shouts of thousands preparing for the final blow. For them, each day felt borrowed, each sunrise a fragile reprieve. To survive meant hoping against hope that reinforcements would come in time. But for Kara Mustafa, the siege was only the latest chapter in a story that stretched back generations. A story of unfinished conquest, vengeance, and the shadow of empire that loomed over all of Europe. Only a year and a half before the siege began, Europe seemed deceptively calm. The Habsburgs and the Ottomans were technically at peace, though few believed such a peace could last. For generations, the frontiers between these two powers had been a land of ceaseless tension. In Hungary especially, villages burned, castles switched hands, and farmers lived under the shadow of raids. But beneath this fragile surface lay centuries of enmity, each empire convinced it had a divine claim not only to territory, but to history itself. The Ottomans looked at the Habsburgs with thinly veiled contempt. To them, the Austrian emperors were usurpers, clinging to a Roman legacy that the Ottomans claimed through conquest. Since the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the sultans saw themselves as the true heirs of Rome, the bearers of an imperial mantle that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Persian frontier. Vienna, in this grand vision, was not just another European stronghold. It was the western gate of Rome's inheritance, waiting to be seized. The Habsburgs, for their part, knew they lived under constant threat. The scars of the 30 Years' War still marked their empire. Burned farmlands, ruined towns, and an economy struggling to recover from decades of religious conflict. Emperor Leopold I, deeply pious and cautious to a fault, knew that his armies were thinly stretched and his subjects weary of war. Yet he also understood that compromise with the Ottomans was temporary at best. The next storm was always brewing beyond the Hungarian plains. Meanwhile, at the Sublime Porte in Istanbul, the Ottoman court buzzed with ambition. Sultan Mehmed IV, more interested in hunting than politics, entrusted his empire's destiny to his Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha. To many in the palace, Kara Mustafa was the embodiment of opportunity. Zealous, calculating, and determined to make his mark on history. He cultivated an image of piety and devotion, but behind it lay a ruthless hunger for power. For him, peace was not an end, but a pause, a chance to prepare for a campaign that would finally humble the Habsburgs. In taverns, markets, and churches across Europe, rumors spread that war was inevitable. Merchants whispered of Ottoman caravans moving supplies across the Balkans, of new bridges built where none had been before, of stockpiles of grain and weapons flowing westward. Few doubted what these signs meant. The eternal enemy was moving again, and this time it seemed Vienna would be the prize. And so, while the banners of peace still fluttered officially between Istanbul and Vienna, the truth was plain to anyone who cared to look. The calm was an illusion. The storm was already gathering. Why 1683? Of all the years that stretched before Kara Mustafa and his Ottoman court, why was this the moment chosen to gamble everything on Vienna? The answer lay in three intertwining threads. Threads that together wove a picture of opportunity too tempting to resist. The first was Austria's weakness. The Habsburg lands were still recovering from the devastation of the 30 Years' War, which had ended only a generation earlier. Whole provinces had been burned out, economies shattered, and populations thinned by famine and disease. Even in Vienna, scars of the conflict remained. Districts slow to rebuild, noble families still struggling to restore fortunes. Though Austria was still formidable on paper, its treasury was strained and its armies far smaller than they had once been. The second was the frontier. In Hungary, the border between Christian and Muslim Europe was not a line, but a wound constantly reopened by raids, counter-raids, and skirmishes. Villages smoldered, fortresses changed flags, and soldiers on both sides bled without decisive victory. This intensifying violence provided Kara Mustafa both a justification and a springboard. If he could march north with overwhelming force, Hungary would fall and Vienna would be laid bare. And the third was Kara Mustafa himself. Unlike many viziers who were content to serve quietly, he dreamed in imperial colors. Where others saw peace as stability, he saw wasted time. He wanted to be remembered not as a caretaker, but as a conqueror, a figure who would secure his place beside Suleiman the Magnificent. Accounts from the Ottoman court speak of his conviction that God had chosen him to finish what Suleiman had begun. Whether driven by genuine zeal or by naked ambition, Kara Mustafa became the architect of the coming storm. To prepare, he focused on what his great predecessor had neglected: infrastructure. In 1529, Suleiman's army had been swallowed by mud and rain, their supply wagons bogged down on primitive roads. Kara Mustafa vowed not to repeat this mistake. Ottoman engineers were ordered to build roads, strengthen bridges, and ensure supply lines stretched like arteries from Istanbul through the Balkans into the Austrian frontier. To outside observers, these preparations looked routine. But to those who knew Ottoman history, the implication was chilling. By midsummer of 1683, caravans of soldiers, wagons, and artillery were moving westward with frightening efficiency. The army that gathered under Kara Mustafa's banners numbered nearly 150,000. A coalition of Turks, Tatars, Balkan levies, and the empire's elite janissaries. In contrast, Vienna's garrison counted barely 15,000 men. The scales were already tipped, and the Ottomans knew it. Europe watched nervously, but the sense of inevitability was strongest in Vienna itself. Diplomats and spies carried whispers of what was coming, but many citizens clung to the fragile hope that it would not be this year, not this season, not now. Yet for Kara Mustafa, the time had come. The Austrians were weakened, the frontier was primed, and his own ambition demanded action. The perfect moment to strike had arrived. When news reached Vienna that the Ottoman host was advancing, panic spread like fire through the streets. Rumors exaggerated the already staggering numbers. Some whispered of 200,000 men marching, of endless cannons rolling forward, of janissaries so disciplined they fought like a single living creature. Even those who had endured the turbulence of the 30 Years' War felt a different kind of dread. This was not a passing raid, but an empire descending upon their gates. Emperor Leopold I did what he believed was necessary for the survival of his dynasty, but to many it looked like abandonment. On July 7, 1683, he fled Vienna with his court, retreating westward toward Linz. To his advisors, the choice was practical. If Vienna fell, the empire still needed its sovereign alive to rally resistance. Yet, to the citizens left behind, the sight of their emperor's departure struck like a wound to morale. As carriages clattered away from the Hofburg Palace, soldiers muttered in bitterness and priests reminded the people that only God, not kings, would decide their fate. Into this vacuum of authority stepped Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg. Barely in his mid-30s, he was a soldier of stern resolve, hardened by battles along the Hungarian frontier. Starhemberg was no grand statesman, no polished courtier, but in the crucible of war he proved to be what Vienna needed most, a commander who refused to surrender. He looked upon the 15,000 men under his command, not professional soldiers alone, but bakers, carpenters, and townsmen pressed into service, and swore that as long as he lived, the city would not yield. The people of Vienna, meanwhile, faced choices no one should have to make. Some families abandoned their homes, fleeing westward in the emperor's wake, hoping to outrun the Ottoman tide. Others chose to stay, either out of duty, desperation, or the inability to leave. Mothers whispered to their children that the walls would protect them, though many did not believe it themselves. Merchants buried treasures in cellars, monks carted relics into hidden vaults, and ordinary citizens stocked what little food they could find. The city that remained was less a capital than a fortress in waiting. The Ottomans advanced steadily, methodically, burning villages, leveling smaller fortresses, and cutting down any resistance in their path. Refugees streamed into Vienna, bringing tales of slaughter and devastation. Every new arrival tightened the noose around the city. More mouths to feed, more fear in the air. By midsummer, Vienna stood braced for a siege. Its emperor gone, its commander grimly resolved, and its people caught between faith and despair. To Kara Mustafa, this was exactly as planned. He wanted the emperor absent, the city isolated, the defenders unsure of whether salvation would ever come. In his mind, Vienna was already a prize in waiting. But for Starhemberg and those who remained behind, the story was only beginning. A story written in smoke, steel, and unyielding defiance. Vienna in 1683 was no ordinary capital. It was a fortress shaped by centuries of tension along the frontier between Christian Europe and the Ottoman world. Massive stone walls wrapped around the city like a clenched fist, bastions jutting outward at sharp angles designed to deflect cannon fire and give defenders overlapping fields of fire. To approach them was to stare up at nearly 200 feet of stone, bristling with gun ports and crowned by rows of defenders ready with muskets and cannons. For Kara Mustafa, these walls were both a challenge and an obsession. He knew that storming them directly would cost thousands of lives, even for an army as vast as his. Instead, he chose the patient art of siegecraft, digging trenches, building earthworks, and planting mines beneath the foundations. He had read the lessons of Crete, where Ottoman sappers had destroyed walls with explosives, and he intended to repeat that grim success at Vienna. Inside the city, Starhemberg organized every able hand. Soldiers patrolled the walls, cannons were rolled into position, and carpenters repaired damaged sections day and night. Nobles stood beside commoners, priests beside merchants, all enlisted in the defense of their home. Even children were pressed into service, carrying water to put out fires and fetching stones for barricades. In every street, the tension was palpable, the sense that life itself had been reduced to waiting, watching, and praying. But Vienna's strength was also its weakness. The walls could shield the people from Ottoman assault, yet they could not feed them. As the siege lines tightened, grain prices soared and families rationed what little bread remained. Wells were guarded closely, lest sabotage or exhaustion run them dry. Disease began to whisper through the crowded quarters, spreading in shadows more silently than any Ottoman soldier. Every week the city endured was another week of hunger gnawing at its heart. Still, morale did not collapse. Priests carried crucifixes along the walls, blessing soldiers before their watches. Bells tolled daily, reminding all that faith and endurance were their strongest weapons. Starhemberg himself was tireless, walking the ramparts, speaking directly to defenders, promising that relief would come, that Vienna was not forgotten. He understood that courage, like powder, could run out, and so he rationed it carefully, never allowing despair to overwhelm discipline. From the walls, the people could see the enemy. Ottoman tents spread across the plain like a second city, bright silks, banners, and the glint of thousands of weapons. At night, the glow of countless fires painted the horizon red, a silent message that Vienna was surrounded, hemmed in by an empire. To some, it felt like staring into the maw of history itself, as though all of Europe's fate balanced on their crumbling ramparts. The siege had begun in earnest. Vienna was now not simply a city. It was a crucible where hunger, faith, and defiance would be tested against the full weight of the Ottoman war machine. When Kara Mustafa arrived before Vienna in July 1683, he wasted no time in imposing order on chaos. His first command was ruthless but effective. Every building, chapel, and farmhouse outside the city walls was to be torn down. The Ottomans stripped the suburbs bare, using the timber and stone to build their own fortifications while denying the defenders any cover. What had once been a lively ring of villages became a barren killing ground, ensuring that anyone venturing beyond the gates would face nothing but open exposure. The heart of Ottoman strategy lay underground. Kara Mustafa was determined to avoid costly frontal assaults, and so he turned to the patient craft of the sapper. His men began to dig first trenches, zigzagging lines that crept ever closer to the walls, then deeper tunnels burrowing beneath the earth. The plan was to pack these mines with barrels of gunpowder and shatter Vienna's bastions from below. It was a method proven during the long struggle for Crete, and if successful here, it would bring the Habsburg fortress crashing down. Above ground, the trenches grew like veins across the plain. They shielded Ottoman soldiers from Vienna's cannons and allowed engineers to push their works ever forward. To the defenders peering down from the walls, it was a slow-motion nightmare. Each day, the earthworks crept closer. Each night, the sound of picks and shovels echoed faintly beneath the city. The soldiers knew what it meant. Somewhere under their feet, the enemy was preparing to blow them sky-high. Inside Vienna, Starhemberg countered as best he could. He sent patrols to sally out at night, setting fire to siege works, ambushing sappers, and dragging prisoners back through the gates. These sorties were daring but costly, for every man lost thinned the already desperate garrison. To fight above the walls and below them was a torment that strained both discipline and sanity. The tension was not only military, but psychological. Ottoman drums beat in relentless rhythm, echoing through the night to rob the defenders of sleep. Shouts of muezzins called the faithful to prayer across the plains, reminders that this siege was not merely a contest of armies, but of civilizations, faiths, and destinies. For the people huddled within the city, the sound carried a chilling message. Their enemy was countless, tireless, and certain of divine victory. Yet time was not on Kara Mustafa's side. Each week of siege was another week for Europe to stir. News of Vienna's plight traveled by courier and priest, by merchant and soldier, until it reached the courts of Krakow, Venice, and Rome. Emperor Leopold, though absent, had not been idle. He sent word that the defense of Vienna was the defense of Christendom itself, and that every throne west of the Danube must answer the call. For Kara Mustafa, the mines beneath Vienna's walls were a race against time. He knew that sooner or later relief would come. His challenge was simple and terrible. Could he destroy the city before its saviors appeared on the horizon? As the Ottoman trenches snaked ever closer to Vienna, messengers rode across Europe carrying desperate pleas for aid. Emperor Leopold, from his refuge in Linz, wrote letters invoking both politics and faith, framing the siege not as a single city's plight, but as the front line of Christian civilization itself. The fall of Vienna, he warned, would open the road to the German states, perhaps even to Rome. If the Habsburgs collapsed, no kingdom west of the Danube would be safe. The appeal found its strongest echo in Rome. Pope Innocent XI, already wary of Ottoman advances in the Mediterranean, seized upon Vienna's peril as an opportunity to forge unity among Europe's often feuding powers. He cast the defense of the city as a holy cause, a continuation of the Crusades in spirit, if not in name. From pulpits across Christendom, priests thundered sermons that declared Vienna's walls to be the bulwark of faith. Donations poured in, and banners bearing the cross were unfurled once more. But transforming inspiration into action was no simple matter. Europe in the 17th century was a mosaic of rivalries. Germans mistrusted Poles, Venetians resented Austrians, and the various princes of the Holy Roman Empire squabbled over precedence and privilege. Yet the Ottoman threat was so immense, so undeniable, that even old enemies were forced into alliance. Slowly, painfully, the Holy League began to take shape, an uneasy coalition bound by desperation more than love. At its heart stood Charles of Lorraine, appointed commander of the imperial forces, and King John III Sobieski of Poland, a monarch both admired and feared for his daring cavalry tactics. Venice pledged naval support, while smaller German principalities contributed men and supplies. Each came with their own motives: glory, faith, survival. But together they promised what Vienna needed most: reinforcements. The propaganda of the moment was potent. Broadsheets and letters described Vienna as the shield of Christendom. Priests compared the struggle to ancient battles where Christians had held against overwhelming odds. In taverns from Krakow to Cologne, men toasted the coming fight, though many prayed just as fervently that their sons would be spared from marching into it. Still, the promise of a united front did not erase the practical difficulties. Armies had to be raised, supplies gathered, roads cleared, and above all, jealousies soothed. Weeks passed as messengers argued, princes delayed, and generals calculated. For Vienna, enduring hunger and nightly bombardment, the delays were maddening. Every day the Holy League spent gathering its strength was another day the city endured alone. And yet, the idea of a crusade had been reborn. Across Europe, banners began to move, drums began to beat, and the long march toward Vienna had begun. For all the lofty words spoken in pulpits and palaces, the march to Vienna was anything but swift. The armies of the Holy League were vast on paper, but slow in reality, hampered by terrain, politics, and mistrust. Every contingent had its own priorities, every commander his own pride. What Vienna needed was unity. What it received was hesitation. The Polish army, led by King John Sobieski himself, faced perhaps the most grueling march of all. To reach Vienna, they had to cross mountain passes and force their cavalry through dense forests. Even the famed winged Hussars, armor and wings glittered like fire in the sun, struggled to move through such obstacles. Their progress was measured in weary miles, their horses straining, their men hungry and exhausted. Yet Sobieski drove them on, knowing that every day lost meant Vienna's chances of survival grew slimmer. The Germans and Austrians were no less burdened. Supplies had to be gathered from scattered principalities, roads repaired, and bridges rebuilt to bear the weight of artillery. Petty quarrels erupted between nobles who saw the campaign as an opportunity for prestige as much as salvation. Charles of Lorraine, tasked with holding the fragile coalition together, spent as much time negotiating between bickering allies as he did planning strategy. Meanwhile, inside Vienna, the siege ground on relentlessly. By early September, Ottoman miners succeeded in blowing open one of the outer bastions. The explosion ripped through stone and earth, leaving a gaping wound in the city's defenses. Janissaries surged forward, clashing with defenders in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Starhemberg himself was said to have fought among the men, rallying them with pistol and sword. Somehow the breach was contained, but it came at terrible cost. Hunger gnawed deeper. The city's bakeries rationed loaves so thin they barely sustained life. Disease stalked the crowded streets, carried by fleas and dirty water. Families huddled in churches, praying for deliverance as cannon fire thundered above. Yet for all the misery, Vienna's spirit did not collapse. The defenders held fast to the belief that salvation must be near. From the walls, they could see the Ottoman trenches creeping closer, zigzagging lines now almost at the moat. Each night, The muffled thud of picks and shovels reminded them that another mine was being prepared. And yet, beyond the horizon, rumor carried whispers of Allied banners moving through the forests, of Polish cavalry drawing closer, of Germans assembling on the march. The question that hung over the city was as stark as the smoke rising from its ruined bastions. Would the Allies arrive in time, or would Vienna be crushed before their banners appeared on the hills? By the second week of September, Vienna had reached the edge of despair. Food stores dwindled to almost nothing. Horses were slaughtered, then dogs, then even rats, anything that might stave off hunger for one more day. Families huddled in dark cellars, praying not for comfort, but for endurance. Above them, the walls bore the scars of constant bombardment, battered by cannon and shaken by subterranean explosions. On September 11th, the Ottomans unleashed one of their most devastating mines. A thunderous explosion tore through a section of the walls, hurling stone and earth skyward in a cloud of dust and fire. When the smoke cleared, a yawning breach gaped in Vienna's defenses. The Janissaries surged forward, their disciplined ranks pressing into the gap with relentless force. For a moment, it seemed the city would be swallowed then and there. But inside Vienna, desperation birthed defiance. Starhemberg and his officers rallied the defenders, throwing every available man into the breach. Priests carried crosses into the melee, urging the faithful not to falter. Citizens who had never held weapons before rushed forward with pikes, axes, even kitchen knives. Women carried buckets of water to douse flames and hurled stones from the walls. The clash was brutal, a swirl of smoke and blood, but by sheer will, the breach was sealed. Yet the defenders knew another explosion could come at any moment. That night, patrols combed the walls and cellars, searching frantically for signs of more mines. And there, in the faint light of torches, they found it. Another bomb hidden beneath the earth, fuse already burning. In what seemed like a miracle, a handful of Viennese soldiers extinguished the fuse just moments before detonation. Had it exploded, the wall might have collapsed entirely, and with it the last hope of resistance. Still, survival came at a terrible price. The garrison was exhausted, wounded, and starving. Supplies of powder and shot were dwindling. Each day, the Ottoman trenches crept closer, and Kara Mustafa's army seemed endless. To many within the city, it felt as though they were fighting not men, but inevitability itself. And yet, even in this darkest hour, rumors whispered through the ranks. Some said banners had been sighted beyond the forests, that Allied forces were drawing near. Others dared not believe it, for disappointment would be worse than death. For Starhemberg, there was only one truth. The city had to hold one more day, then another and another until salvation or ruin came at last. At dawn on September 12th, a strange sound carried over Vienna's battered walls. Not the familiar boom of Ottoman cannon, but the distant roll of drums and the bray of foreign trumpets. From the towers, sentries peered northward, their eyes straining through morning haze. There, upon the ridges of the Kahlenberg hills, banners were stirring in the wind. For the first time in months, the defenders glimpsed something they had scarcely dared to imagine: the standards of their allies. The relief army had come at last. The coalition that assembled on the Kahlenberg was as diverse as Europe itself. Charles of Lorraine's imperial troops held the left, hardened veterans who had marched for weeks across a ravaged land. In the center stood the contingents of Bavaria, Saxony, and Franconia, Germans in gleaming cuirasses and bright plumes, determined to prove their worth. To the right, the ground still lay empty, for the Poles had not yet arrived. But the promise of their coming gave the defenders hope. For Kara Mustafa, the sight was both expected and alarming. He had always known relief might come, but he had gambled that Vienna would fall before it arrived. Now, as the Ottoman army shifted to face this new threat, the Grand Vizier found himself forced into a dangerous balancing act: finish breaking Vienna's walls or turn fully to meet the Christian host gathering above him. The battlefield was a vast chessboard. The Ottomans commanded the plains below, their trenches coiling like scars around the city. The Holy League now occupied the high ground of the Kahlenberg, a position that gave them both visibility and an advantage in defense. Between them lay Vienna itself, bruised, starved, and waiting for the hammer to fall. For the people inside the city, the sight of Allied banners unfurling above the hills was like the first breath after drowning. Bells rang from the cathedral towers, signaling that salvation was near. Soldiers on the walls cheered, though their cheers were muffled by exhaustion. Some wept openly, clutching rosaries or crossing themselves. Yet no one dared to celebrate too soon, for the Ottomans still outnumbered their rescuers, and a single mistake could turn salvation into slaughter. The relief army, too, knew the stakes. Their ranks were weary from the long march, and their supply lines stretched thin. Sobieski's Poles, still forcing their way through the forests, had yet to appear. If Kara Mustafa struck swiftly, he might crush the coalition before it fully assembled. Every hour mattered. On that morning, the defenders of Vienna and the soldiers of the Holy League shared the same thought. The decisive battle was no longer days away. It was beginning here now on the Kahlenberg. The morning of September 12th broke with fire and steel. Before the sun had fully risen, Ottoman scouts clashed with the vanguard of the Holy League, and soon the rumble of musket fire rolled across the plain. The relief army, still arranging itself along the ridges of the Kahlenberg, found itself thrown immediately into combat. There was no time for ceremony, no long speeches, only the urgent command to hold the line. On the left, Charles of Lorraine deployed his imperial troops. Veterans of border wars with the Ottomans, they fought with grim determination, their muskets cracking in disciplined volleys. To their right, German contingents formed dense ranks, bristling with pikes and muskets. From above, they poured fire down into the plain, repelling wave after wave of Ottoman cavalry. The high ground gave them an edge, but it also made them a target. Ottoman gunners wheeled forward field cannons, their iron balls tearing through trees and men alike. The plain below became a storm of dust and chaos. Ottoman cavalry surged upward in repeated charges, their lances flashing, their horses pounding the earth like thunder. Time and again they slammed into the Christian lines, only to be thrown back by a wall of steel and shot. The defenders fired in rotations, one rank kneeling, one standing, one reloading, creating a rhythm of death that chewed into the attackers. Still, the assaults did not stop. The Ottomans knew that if they could break the Holy League before the Poles arrived, victory would be theirs. Within Vienna, the citizens watched the battle unfold from their shattered ramparts. They saw smoke rising from the hills, heard the roar of cannons echo through the valley. For some, it was torment to stand so close to salvation, yet remain trapped behind their walls. Starhemberg, ever vigilant, warned his men not to falter, reminding them that their task was to hold, no matter what they saw or heard beyond the gates. Through it all, Kara Mustafa remained calculating. He still held back the Janissaries, his most elite force, saving them for the moment when Vienna's defenses finally cracked. He believed the city was on the verge of collapse, and that committing his best troops too early would waste their power. Instead, he hurled cavalry and auxiliary units against the Holy League, seeking to buy time for his sappers to finish the work beneath Vienna. It was a gamble, a fatal hesitation disguised as strategy. While the walls of Vienna still stood, the battle on the Kahlenberg grew fiercer with every hour. The Holy League, battered but unbroken, clung to the high ground, waiting for the one force that had not yet arrived, Sobieski and the Poles. The day had only begun, and already the fate of Europe trembled on the ridge. As the battle raged along the slopes of the Kahlenberg, Kara Mustafa faced the decision that would define his life. Before him stretched nearly 150,000 men, yet his most disciplined and fearsome soldiers, the Janissaries, remained in reserve. Clad in their white felt caps and flowing uniforms, the Janissaries were the pride of the empire, drilled from childhood to fight with unwavering discipline. Many within his camp urged that they be unleashed at once to smash the Christian army before its scattered contingents fully united. But Kara Mustafa hesitated. To him, Vienna itself was the true prize, and he feared that committing the Janissaries to the hills would leave his grip on the city vulnerable. In his mind, the defenders were nearly spent, the walls were crumbling, the garrison starving. Surely one more mine, one more assault would finish them. Why risk his elite warriors on a pitched battle in the forests and ridges when victory seemed already at hand? It was a decision rooted in pride as much as calculation. Kara Mustafa dreamed not merely of victory, but of a triumph so overwhelming that it would crown him with glory in Istanbul. He wanted Vienna delivered intact, a jewel to present to his sultan, not a ruin plundered by impatient soldiers. Restraint, he believed, would yield him greater rewards. Yet on the Kahlenberg that restraint proved deadly. The imperial and German contingents, though battered, held their ground with grim determination. Their defensive line stiffened with every failed Ottoman charge. Each hour they endured was another hour closer to the arrival of Sobieski's Poles. History offers cruel comparisons. At Lepanto in 1571, Ottoman commanders had committed their full strength at once, overwhelming Christian fleets until sheer chance and desperation turned the tide. In Crete, years of attritional warfare had finally ground down Venetian resistance, only because no mercy had been shown. But here before Vienna, Kara Mustafa clung to caution, unwilling to spend the empire's finest troops until conditions were perfect. The conditions, however, would never be perfect. By mid-afternoon, as the sun beat down on smoke-filled slopes, whispers rippled through the Christian ranks. The Poles were near. Scouts reported movement in the forests, the sound of hooves on the march. The long-delayed right wing of the Holy League was about to take its place. Still, Kara Mustafa held back, convinced he could break Vienna and its would-be saviors both. What he did not see was that his moment had already passed. The hesitation that seemed to him prudent would soon become his undoing. As the afternoon wore on, the ridge of the Kahlenberg shuddered with fresh energy. At last, from the dense Viennese woods, the Polish banners emerged. Green, crimson, and white silks caught the sunlight, and above them the black eagle of Poland and the Virgin Mary's image fluttered defiantly in the wind. The relief army's missing wing had arrived, and at its head rode King Jan III Sobieski. Sobieski was no stranger to the Ottomans. He had fought them for much of his reign, suffering defeats and winning victories that had made him one of Europe's most seasoned commanders. Where others fretted over terrain and supply, he read the field with a soldier's eye. Clad in armor that gleamed beneath his heavy cloak, he surveyed the battlefield and immediately grasped the moment. The Holy League had endured the Ottoman storm all day. Now was the time not for defense, but for a blow that could break the siege entirely. Behind him rode the pride of Poland, the winged Hussars. Each man was a spectacle of war. Lances gleaming, armor polished, and great wooden frames rising from their backs, adorned with wings of eagle or swan feathers. These were not mere decoration. The wings were said to roar in the wind as the Hussars charged, unnerving enemy horses and men alike. To their foes, they seemed less like soldiers and more like avenging spirits. But Sobieski was more than a commander of cavalry. He was a king who shared the hardships of his men. He had ridden with them through forests and rivers, eating the same rations, sleeping in the mud, urging them onward mile by mile. His presence on the field was more than symbolic. It was the embodiment of the promise made to Vienna, that Poland would come and that Christendom would not abandon its frontier. As his troops poured out of the forests and took their place on the right flank of the Holy League, cheers erupted from the beleaguered defenders within Vienna's walls. Bells rang once more in the Stephansdom, their tolling carrying across the city like a heartbeat returning to life. Even the exhausted garrison found renewed strength at the sight, knowing that the battle's balance had shifted. Kara Mustafa, watching from his command post, realized the peril. What had been a contest of attrition was now tilting against him. The Holy League was united at last, Imperials, Germans, and Poles shoulder to shoulder. Still, he held to his belief that the Janissaries, unbloodied and waiting, would deliver him victory. Sobieski thought otherwise. He saw a weary enemy spread too thin, and he prepared to unleash the weapon that would decide the day, the largest cavalry charge in history. The sun dipped low on September 12th, casting long shadows across the battlefield. Dust and smoke veiled the plain where Imperial and German infantry still clung stubbornly to their lines. For hours they had endured wave after wave of Ottoman attacks, their muskets hot from constant firing, their shoulders bruised from the recoil. Now, at last, relief had arrived, not in cautious steps, but in thunder. At 6 o'clock in the evening, Sobieski gave the signal. From the wooded slopes of the Kahlenberg, the Polish cavalry began to form. First in clusters, then in great sweeping lines, thousands of horsemen arrayed themselves in perfect order. At their center, the famed winged hussars lowered their lances. Sunlight caught on steel, on plumes, and gilded armor until they seemed less an army than a storm made flesh. Behind them stretched a host of allies, Austrian and German cavalrymen, some 15,000 strong, drawn into Sobieski's grand design. The air grew heavy with silence. Then came the sound. At first a murmur, like wind through trees, then a rumble, growing louder and louder until it became a roar that shook the very earth. Hooves struck the hillside like a drumbeat of doom. Dust billowed skyward as 18,000 horsemen descended the slopes together, the ground trembling beneath their weight. Ottoman soldiers froze at the sight. Many had fought cavalry before, but never in such numbers, never with such terrifying spectacle. The hussars' wings whistled in the wind, creating a sound that mingled with the thunder of hooves, a sound that seemed not of men, but of fate itself bearing down. When the charge struck, it was like a hammer shattering glass. The Ottoman lines buckled instantly, the first ranks crushed beneath the avalanche of horses and steel. Lances splintered, sabers flashed, and the defenders broke into chaos. What had been a disciplined host only hours before now dissolved into panic. Sobieski rode at the forefront, urging his men deeper into the fray. His cry carried above the din, "God is with us!" Behind him, the charge rolled forward like a tidal wave, sweeping through camp and trench alike. Ottoman soldiers fled in every direction, abandoning positions, throwing down arms, desperate to escape the storm that had engulfed them. From Vienna's walls, defenders erupted into cheers, some disbelieving what their eyes beheld. The largest cavalry charge in human history was not a tale. It was happening before them, breaking the siege in a single thunderous stroke. For Kara Mustafa, the sight was ruin. His careful trenches, his patient mines, his vision of glory, all crumbled in minutes beneath the hooves of Sobieski's riders. What had seemed destined for triumph now teetered on the edge of disaster. The tide had turned, and the night would bring not conquest, but collapse. The impact of Sobieski's charge tore through the Ottoman host like lightning through dry timber. What began as a ripple of panic at the front lines quickly surged into a wave that consumed the entire camp. Soldiers who had held firm through weeks of siege now broke in terror, fleeing across the plain as cavalry swept through their ranks. Standards fell, trenches were abandoned, and the once formidable Ottoman war machine dissolved into chaos. The Janissaries, held back so long, were finally ordered into action. But it was too late. Thrust into a battlefield already collapsing, they could do little but fight desperate rearguard actions. Some rallied briefly, forming knots of resistance that slowed the Polish hussars for moments at a time. Yet even their discipline could not withstand the sheer momentum of 18,000 horsemen crashing through the heart of the army. Kara Mustafa's most precious reserve had been squandered, their strength wasted not in triumph, but in retreat. Inside Vienna, the sound of battle changed. Where once the defenders had heard only the steady drumbeat of Ottoman guns, now came the unmistakable roar of victory. Cheers rang from the ramparts as soldiers saw the enemy faltering, saw their banners trampled into the dust. Starhemberg, seizing the moment, flung open the gates. The garrison surged out in a desperate counterattack, pouring down the causeways to strike the besiegers in their confusion. The clash became a rout. Ottoman trenches, once so carefully constructed, became traps as fleeing soldiers tripped and fell in the dark. Supply wagons overturned, spilling barrels of powder and crates of food into the dirt. Horses bolted, riderless, their saddles still glinting with guilt. The plains that had been an orderly encampment only days before now resembled a battlefield strewn with wreckage, men, and memories of what might have been. Kara Mustafa himself watched from a distance, his vision of victory collapsing before his eyes. In his mind, the city should already have been his, the Holy League scattered, Europe's gate broken open. Instead, he saw his army disintegrating, not from exhaustion or attrition, but from a single thunderous stroke of cavalry. For a commander who had believed caution would preserve his triumph, the irony was bitter indeed. By nightfall, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Ottomans who had come as conquerors now fled as survivors. Vienna still stood, its walls scarred but unbroken, its people bloodied but alive. For the defenders who had endured hunger, terror, and despair, the sight of the enemy in flight was more than victory. It was deliverance. The Siege of Vienna had ended in a heartbeat, transformed from the brink of collapse to a triumph that would echo through centuries. But the cost and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. When the dust of battle finally settled, Vienna stood in stunned silence. For 2 long months, the city had lived under the shadow of annihilation. Now, in the span of a single evening, that shadow was gone. The Ottoman army, once the most feared host in the world, had melted away into the night. Fires smoldered in their abandoned camps. Tents flapped empty in the wind, and the vast encirclement that had strangled Vienna lay broken. Inside the walls, relief gave way to disbelief. Families poured into the streets, weeping and embracing as church bells rang with a fury not heard since the city's founding. Priests led processions through smoke-blackened avenues, holding aloft relics and crucifixes as soldiers fell to their knees in prayer. Many could scarcely comprehend what had happened. One day they were on the brink of starvation and collapse. The next, their enemies were gone. Survivors would later speak of it as if heaven itself had intervened. Count Starhemberg, exhausted and wounded, walked the ramparts he had sworn to defend. His garrison was reduced to a fraction of its original strength, scarred, bloodied, and hollow-eyed. But they had endured. In their faces, he saw what no statistics could measure, the defiance of a city that had refused to yield, even when its emperor had fled. For Vienna, his name would become synonymous with unshakable courage. For Kara Mustafa, the story ended far differently. He retreated east with what remained of his army, carrying not spoils but shame. His gamble had failed, and with it the dream of planting the crescent over Vienna's towers. The Sultan, furious at the catastrophe, ordered his execution. In Belgrade that same year, the Grand Vizier who had marched with such ambition was strangled with a silken cord, the traditional fate of disgraced Ottoman officials. His fall was as swift and final as his defeat. Yet the true measure of victory was not found in Kara Mustafa's death, but in what Vienna's survival meant for Europe. The lifting of the siege was more than a battle won. It was a turning point. For the first time in generations, the Ottomans had been hurled back, not merely contained. The myth of their invincibility was shattered, and the long arc of their decline had begun. Still, for those within the walls, such grand reflections came later. On that September night, what mattered was simpler. The nightmare was over, the city still stood, and the bells of Vienna rang in triumph. The lifting of the siege did not end the war, it transformed it. What had begun as Kara Mustafa's bold strike to seize Vienna became the moment when the tide of Ottoman expansion into Europe finally receded. The shock of defeat reverberated across the continent, not only in Vienna's jubilant streets, but in the courts of kings, sultans, and princes. For the Habsburgs, the victory was more than survival, it was rebirth. Emperor Leopold, who had fled in panic, now returned to a city that hailed him as sovereign of a redeemed empire. His armies, emboldened by the triumph, pushed eastward into Hungary, reclaiming fortresses that had been under Ottoman rule for more than a century. What had once seemed an impossible frontier now became a field of opportunity. Within a generation, much of Hungary would be torn from the Ottoman grasp. The Holy League, forged in desperation, did not dissolve after the battle. Instead, the victory at Vienna became the foundation for a wider counteroffensive. Poles, Germans, Austrians, Venetians, and even the Papal States cooperated in campaigns that drove deeper into Ottoman territory. The sense that Christendom had been spared by divine providence gave these campaigns a zeal that extended far beyond strategy. Vienna was no longer simply a city saved. It was a symbol of resistance turned into resurgence. For the Ottoman Empire, the battle marked the beginning of a slow decline. Though the empire remained vast, its aura of invincibility had been pierced. No longer could Istanbul project power unchecked into Central Europe. Instead, the empire found itself increasingly on the defensive, forced to guard borders rather than expand them. The failure at Vienna weakened the authority of the Sultan and fueled factional struggles within the court. The strangling of Kara Mustafa was not only punishment, but also a warning to others. Failure could not be forgiven. Yet success was slipping further from reach. Historians would later call 1683 a hinge year, the moment when Ottoman power in Europe peaked and then began to wane while Habsburg influence surged. The siege had been more than a clash of armies. It was the collision of two visions of empire. One sought to push westward in conquest, the other to reclaim lands and legitimacy. On the walls of Vienna, that balance shifted forever. And yet, amid the grandeur of empires rising and falling, the human cost lingered. The fields around Vienna were strewn with bodies. The city's streets filled with the hungry and the wounded. Survivors bore scars that no victory could erase. For them, the triumph was real, but it was paid for in blood and sorrow. The Siege of Vienna was thus not only a turning point of empires, but also a reminder that history's great shifts are built on the suffering of ordinary lives. In the years that followed, the Siege of Vienna passed swiftly into legend. What had been a desperate, harrowing struggle for survival became retold as a moment of near-miraculous deliverance. From Krakow to Rome, from Munich to Paris, ballads and sermons celebrated the cavalry charge that thundered down the Kahlenberg and scattered the Ottoman host. For generations, children would grow up hearing that on September 12, 1683, Europe had been saved. King John III Sobieski became immortalized as the savior of Christendom. Painters captured him astride a white steed, saber aloft, as if divinely appointed to strike the decisive blow. In Poland, he was revered as a national hero. In Rome, he was hailed as God's chosen warrior. Yet this mythic image obscured the harsher reality, that the victory had been born of weeks of starvation, fear, and sacrifice by the people of Vienna, who endured the siege long enough for help to arrive. Vienna itself embraced its role as the bastion of Europe. Each anniversary of the battle was marked with bells and masses, reminding citizens that their city had stood at the edge of destruction and survived. Over time, the siege wove itself into the very identity of the Habsburg monarchy, proof that divine favor and imperial destiny were on their side. But legend is never the whole story. To the Ottomans, Vienna was remembered not as a miracle denied, but as a bitter failure, a campaign that should have succeeded, undone by hesitation and overconfidence. For Istanbul, the loss marked the beginning of a long decline, though few could admit it openly. The memory of Vienna was thus a wound carried quietly, even as Europe celebrated loudly. And beyond the clash of empires, the siege left quieter legacies. Refugees who had fled returned to rebuild their homes. Fields once trampled by armies were tilled again. Stories were passed down of priests extinguishing fuses, of women hurling stones from the walls, of children carrying powder to the ramparts. These fragments of human courage, though smaller than Sobieski's charge, were no less vital to the city's survival. The Siege of Vienna closed one chapter of history and opened another. No longer would the Ottomans press further into the heart of Europe. Instead, the continent's balance shifted. The Habsburgs ascended, the Holy League emboldened, and the Ottoman Empire set on a path of slow retreat. It was both an end and a beginning, a hinge upon which centuries turned. Even now, more than 3 centuries later, the story of 1683 resonates, half history, half legend. It is a tale of ambition and desperation, of faith and folly, of how a single city became the stage on which the fate of empires was decided. And like all such tales, it reminds us that history is never just strategy and numbers. It is courage, fear, and the fragile choices of human beings caught in moments that echo far beyond their own lives.